Well, today it should be a somewhat of more of a familiar context, as we will be looking at the sacred text of our, primarily our faith, the Christian faith. But I'll be adding on to that, well, kind of going over some of the developments of it and understanding the context of how some of these texts have come about. Plus, at the end, I'll kind of talk about some of the other texts that are not canonized in the Bible. So the primary text for Christians is what? Jeopardy question. The Bible is? Come on, it's Jeopardy, right? Jeopardy, you have to answer it as a question. What is the Bible? Right? Okay, so of course it's the Bible, but the Bible, as we know, just like the other sacred texts of Judaism, it's not a single book, right? We always call it's the book, right? The good book, and so forth. Well, it's not a book, just like the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. It's a collection of books. It's a library. It's a collection of many books. In fact, the Bible that we use consists of 66 books. This is a Protestant Bible. 66 books, 39 of them are from the Old Testament, which is taken from the Hebrew Bible, and then 27 from the New Testament, which were the development. And part of this process of the New Testament books being added on was not something that happened, not even during the first century. It was years, centuries of debate, discussions, and what I'll get into is looking at some of the other texts that didn't make the cut, put it that way, right? Now, the Bible, and of course, and I do have here, and I'll refer to it, a list of all the books in the Old Testament, or what we call the Hebrew Bible, and how the different traditions differ. So I'll get to that in a bit. And then, of course, part of the Holy Bible, that's in addition to the 66 books, are what we call the Apocrypha. And these apocryphal books are used by our Catholic brothers and sisters, as well as our Orthodox Christian groups. So the Bible, as many of you know, is probably the most widely published and read book in history. In America, they say that 80%, 88% of all households have at least one Bible. And I'm sure how many of you have a Bible at home? Look at that, 100%. How many of you have at least 4 Bibles at home? See, that's at least 88%. That's the average in most households. So it's widely available. It's everywhere. Thank you to the Gideons who put Bibles in every hotel room, right? But the way our Bible has come about, of course, as I mentioned, the first part of our Bible, our text, is taken from our Jewish heritage of the Hebrew Bible. However, our Old Testament is actually slightly different than the Hebrew Bible. Now, as Protestants, we have the same books. Well, actually, I take that back. We have the same writings? Well, sort of. But the books they're in different orders, and some of the books are combined in the Hebrew Bible versus in the Christian Bible, in our Bibles, it's separated out. For example, we have 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. In the Hebrew Bible, it's just Samuel. We have the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. And in the Hebrew Bible, it's actually one book, Ezra and Nehemiah. And in the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, they call it the Esdras. So they call it different things. It's the same book, but it's combined. Plus, in the Orthodox Church and in the Catholic Church, they have additional chapters as well. As Protestants go, and I'll explain how this came about, but the Protestants, for the most part, the Protestant Bible, the Bible that we use, have at least the same content as the Hebrew Bible, right? So right now, the order is different, and in fact, right now we can actually look at it. So it took me a while to type all this out, trying to make sure that it was accurate. So you can take this home, put it on your refrigerator, frame it, right? There's going to be a test. Yeah, exactly. So if you let's look at and I couldn't fit it in one page, so you have to flip it. The first 5 books of the Bible is the same, and that's what we call the Torah, or what we call the law. In the Catholic Church, in Greek, it's called the Pentateuch, which just means the first 5 books. And that is all the same. And as I talked about 2 weeks ago, the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish tradition, the first 5 books is the primary text. So for our Jewish brothers and sisters, the first 5 books is the primary sacred scripture, and then the other books of the Hebrew Bible kind of are there to kind of talk about the history of the Israelites as they lived out the first 5 books. So the first 5 books is the same, whether it be in the Hebrew Bible, the Orthodox Bible, the Catholic Bible, the Protestant Bible. You flip the page. And then you get into all the differences. So, like I said, for the Hebrew Bible, our Jewish brothers and sisters, they see it as, in 3 parts: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, the law of God, the history of the people, and the reflections. But in the Old Testament for Christians, we actually have rearranged a lot of this, primarily to view it from a Christian faith lens, and then the way Christians look at the Old Testament, unfortunately, because it's not proper, right? It's the Hebrew Bible, but for most Christians, we see the Old Testament as a precursor to the New Testament, which in a way doesn't do justice to the actual text itself. So one of the things that my Old Testament professor would always challenge us is to, when we read the Old Testament, to put aside our Christian biases and read it as if you were an Israelite at that time, because the text shifts or is different. For example, for the Christian church, as we began adopt, so in the beginning, the early church, it grew out of the Jewish faith, and the early church didn't have our own text. Basically, the Hebrew Bible was the text of the Jewish community, and so the Hebrew Bible was the primary text. But as the church grew, the church kind of started developing the stories and the writings. It started to view these these Hebrew Bible texts, again, through the lens of the Christian faith. An example of that, and of course, and for Christianity, the early church started to really grow when Apostle Paul, and we'll be talking about him, started to take the gospel message out into the Gentile people who primarily spoke Greek. And so when it came to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, the text that Paul would have been able to refer to in Greek would have been what is the Septuagint. Okay, I talked about this 2 weeks ago. The king of Egypt around 2nd century BC ordered that the Torah, the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible be translated into Greek, and that's what they used. Now, the problem with translation, there's always problems with translation, is that you get words that don't get translated quite accurately, and when you're talking about sacred texts where you have community of people that view those texts as sacred, every word matters. A clear example of that is Isaiah 7. That's one of the texts that we read during Christmas time, where it says, in the Hebrew Bible, it says, a young woman shall bear a child. Well, when they translated in the Septuagint, they translated young woman into virgin in the Greek. And so then the Christian communities took that and ran with it, and thus the Virgin Mary context, the whole Jesus was born a virgin, becomes a critical part of the Christian faith, even though the Jewish text in Isaiah wasn't talking about that. It was talking about any young woman having a child as a hope of a future, right? Anytime you have, come on, when babies are born, we're like, yay! No matter what struggles we go through, right? Well, actually, sometimes, yeah, anyhow. All right, so when it comes to, again, the New Testament being developed, our Christian faith is based upon, well, whom? Jesus. Our faith is based upon Jesus. The problem with our faith is that, or the problem with Jesus, is that he never wrote anything down, right? And so everything that we have is taken as second or third hand. And even that, it's also a translation of a translation. My New Testament professor once joked about how, in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, there's a story of how the Jewish leaders caught a woman in adultery, right? And they apparently, I don't know what happened to the other partner, but anyhow, they dragged the woman to Jesus and asked Jesus, what should we do with this woman who was caught red-handed in the act of adultery? And what does Jesus do? He stoops down and he starts writing something on the ground, which made everyone, all the accusers just drop their stones and walk away. Well, my New Testament professor would joke around and say, and nobody thought about preserving what he wrote, because we don't know. And that's the only story or the account of him ever writing anything. So one of the problems that we have in our Christian faith is that our sacred text is not something that is dictated or is one that we can say, yes, authoritatively, this is what Jesus said. Even the Gospels, right, and our Bible, even though we have things written in red, Jesus doesn't speak red, right? Dave, you had a question.
That story about the woman that committed adultery, that's not in the original Greek Bible. That was added later.
It is in brackets, yes. But again, so what actually that says is that the many manuscripts, and we will get to this, is that the manuscripts, they're multiple. And there is, in fact, Bill and I were actually talking about a course where we actually do a class on some of these redactive biblical criticism techniques of when you have multiple manuscripts, how do you know which is original? How do you know that something didn't get left out, or if something got added in? How do you know that? What's the difference between this, one being left out and the other one being added in? You don't know, and so there's a whole process of trying to figure that out. So, but that is a good point. So that is one of the struggles with our Christian faith or our Christian sacred text, is that we are working off of a process of trying to create something that is of authority, of sacredness, that is not defined, that is not clearly defined. All right? Again, everything that we know of Jesus is through second or third hand source. All right? The earliest of texts in our New Testament is not the Gospels, but it's the epistles, right? It's the writings from Paul are the earliest. And of course, we know the story of Paul, how he was originally a Pharisee, a religious leader who opposed the new faith that was propagating up among the Jewish community, right? How he opposed Christianity, but through his conversion, recorded in Acts chapter 9, he becomes a devout follower, and then after that, he goes out on these missionary journeys, and because of his missionary journeys, primarily outside of Jerusalem, outside the Jewish community, into the Gentile world, that he began propagating, and the whole context of the message of the Christian message being delivered or shared with the Gentile, Greek-speaking culture that starts to propagate the Christian faith. So, and of course, when he came back from his journeys, he would write these letters. And these letters are what we have in the majority of the New Testament are these letters. Now, the thing about these letters is that you have to understand that these letters to these churches are to very specific audience and a very specific situation, a specific context. It was never meant to be universally applied. Right? So a lot of these letters were very specific, and yet one of the challenges that our Christian faith has done was take these letters and then put it on par with the Gospels and all the others, right? And we don't even know what, because we don't have anything that Jesus wrote. We place it up there as being authoritative, and that has created some of the challenges of debate in theology. Paul's letters have a very clear structure. Yeah, and I use 1 Thessalonians as an example because that is the earliest of the New Testament writings. Most scholars will date that about 49 AD. So even with that, if we kind of use the context of Jesus' ministry being around 30 AD, give or take, that's about 20 years, That's about 20 years after Jesus' ministry, death, and resurrection, and then the disciples going out. And again, we have some of this story as recorded in the book of Acts, which again wasn't really written until past 80 AD, so about 50 years after that. But it does tell about how the early church community started to take that message and start spreading it out, and then Paul, after his conversion, starts going out and spreading the message. And then in 49 AD, after visiting Thessalonica, he writes this letter. It's a very short letter. It's only 5 chapters, and there are 5 short chapters. But again, the structure is very simple. He has a salutation, his greetings. It usually starts off something like, I, Paul, an apostle, or a servant of God, or servant of Jesus, so forth. In Thessalonians, he says, I, Paul, and Silas, and Silvanus, a team that he would take with them. And then there's a prayer of thanksgiving. He usually gives thanks to the community. He's a really proper guy. He gives thanks to the people, for the church in Thessalonica, encourages them for their faithfulness, for all they've done, for their hospitality when he visited the church or the community in Thessalonica. By the way, there's one letter of Paul that he does not give thanks to them. When you read that letter, he was mad. And that's the letter to Galatians. That one, he skips the thanksgiving. He just goes in and says, I am ashamed of you. Anyhow. Well, he said, yeah, do not be ashamed. Anyhow, okay, so there's the thanksgiving, and then there's the body of the letter, which kind of specific, that responds to a very specific struggle or context that church is dealing with. And then he closes it with the benediction or doxology. In the letter to the Thessalonians, the main context in that letter, again, it's a short letter, is that, and it being the earliest of Paul's letter, his primary theology at that time was to remain faithful because Jesus was going to come back really, really soon. In fact, in that letter, he talks about Jesus is coming back any day, so, just don't even bother, doing anything else. Just stay faithful and await the day because Jesus will come again, or will come back during their lifetime. By the time you read some of his other letters, the ones that he wrote towards the end of his life, later on, one of his latter letters would be the letter to the Philippians, which he wrote while he was a prisoner in Rome. his theology is completely different. He talks about, and there's a word that he uses called parousia, and what that word means, it's in Greek, is the delay of Christ's arrival. So there is this sense by that time that, okay, maybe Jesus is not going to come back right away. So then how do we remain faithful in an extended period of time? I mean, it's one thing to encourage the community, you know what, just hang on. It's just, it's like, it's 40 days of Lent, just be faithful. Just do a prayer devotional for 40 days, right? That's easy. But if it's going to take years and years and years, and again, probably Philippians was written around 62 AD, so it's about 12 years later in his ministry, he realized, okay, Jesus is not coming back anytime soon. And so his theology does shift. Understanding the context of these letters is important as we read them, because the problem with the New Testament, especially with Paul's letters, is that they didn't arrange them in any chronological order. The arrangement of Paul's letters in the New Testament is by size. Like, that's going to make a difference. The Quran does that too? What's with that? It was standard. So Romans, so you have the 4 Gospels, you have the Book of Acts, then you have Romans, which has 16 chapters, and then you have First Corinthians, which is also 16 chapters, and then you have 2 Corinthians, which is about 12 chapters, and then you have Galatians, which is 6 chapters, Ephesians, 6 chapters, Colossians, 5 chapters, Philippians, 4 chapters. Yeah, that's all it does. From 16 chapters, it goes all the way down to, and the last one is Philemon, which is just 1 chapter. So that doesn't help us when we read it, right? Unless you kind of have to kind of do the study and dig into, okay, so what is the context and when was he written? When did he write this? Because his theology shifts depending on when he wrote his letters. Of the 13 Pauline letters, another issue that we have is not all of the 13 letters that are attributed to Paul was written by Paul. A very common practice in those days was that, the whole issue with copyright and, copyright infringement and lawyers suing, others, that wasn't a thing back then. I don't know when that became a thing. America, I don't know. But back then, there would be writings, and the writers would dedicate that writing to someone. And so sometimes some of these writings that we call Pauline were probably written by his disciples or someone that was inspired by Paul, wrote something, and then dedicated to Paul, and then it got propagated as a Paul's letter, even though Paul himself didn't write it. So that becomes a problem. Of the 13 letters, there are 7 that all scholars would say that, yes, these are genuine Pauline. And the way they do that is by reading the letter, there is vocabularies, there is theology and context, and using the book of Acts that kind of maps out Paul's missionary journey, they kind of can figure out where he went to and start deducing, the timeline and the context. And of course, the theology and the vocabulary and the way of writing, these 7 are considered genuine Pauline. The letter to the Romans, which is the only one that he wrote to a church that he did not visit, right? He writes the letter to the Romans, to the Church of Rome, as a way of saying, here, I'm hoping to get to Rome, because, Rome is not that close from Jerusalem, I guess, right? And so he writes a letter to Rome saying, I'm looking forward to, I'm hoping to find my way to Rome so I can continue to spread the gospel. And he writes to the Church of Rome that his hope is that they will help support him in the continual spreading of the ministry and send him to Spain. And at that time, he thought that Spain was at the end of the earth. that the world was just from Spain to, I don't know, Babylon. But that was all it was. And so he writes, so Romans is a very clearly a Pauline letter. 1 Corinthians, again, a very specific context. And it's wonderful read because 1 Corinthians talks about the conflicts within society and resolving conflicts, which is so applicable. 2 Corinthians is actually a collection of other Paul's letter that the scholars couldn't figure out what to do with. And so when you read 2 Corinthians, you feel like Paul's like talking about this, and all of a sudden he jumps to talking about this and then goes back to this. It's because it's actually a bunch of other fragments of Paul's letter that we don't have the whole letters to, and they just got stacked up together. And my professor would kind of say, and not only that, the early manuscripts, they just kind of had all these fragments, they just kind of put it right on top of each other. It's almost as if, back then, they didn't have bound books. They had these codexes, which are papyrus writings, single sheets, like this, had it stacked, and some scribe was walking down and tripped, and then went, and just gathered them. So you have these passages that don't match up when you read it. But that's 2 Corinthians. Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Again, Church of Galatians, he was really mad. Philippians, he wrote while he was in prison in Rome. 1 Thessalonians was his very first letter that he wrote. And Philemon is actually a personal reference letter. Philemon was a servant that was sort of imprisoned and befriended Paul, and so Paul writes a friendly reference letter to a fellow community saying, please receive Philemon when he comes out of prison, and receive him as you would receive me. That's what he writes in Philemon. So 7 are genuine. 3 of the 13 letters are what we call Deutero-Pauline. Now, what does that mean, Deutero? Deutero means secondary, or a second reading. So these Deutero-Paulines are what we would call maybe Paul, maybe not Paul, we don't know. If it's not Paul, we kind of figure that it's someone written, whoever wrote these 3 letters, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians, someone who knew Paul pretty well. It would be one of Paul's close associates or maybe one of his disciples. We know that these were written around the same timeline or just shortly afterwards, still within the 1st century. So they're close, but there's something about these letters that just, we know that they're not Paul's. The vocabulary that he uses, some of the context of the writing doesn't quite fit what Paul was going through in those churches. So those are what we call Deutero-Pauline. And then there are 3 last ones, what we call pastoral letters. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. These 3 we know Paul did not write, because these 3 letters talk about establishing the structure of a church. Well, when did Paul live? Paul, his ministry, again, if 1 Thessalonians was the first letter, that was around 49 AD. We know that Paul died around 64 AD by Emperor Nero. The church wasn't some complicated ecclesiastical structure. These were just small gatherings. So, but 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus talks about appointing someone as bishop, so having deacons, having elders. So it's like the structure of a church. So the context makes no sense. But it's in there, and again, it's attributed to Paul, but we know they're clearly not Paul. Now, just because they're not, we know that they're not written by Paul, does that diminish the sacredness or the authority or the value of the text? No. Because in many ways, all of these texts, in many ways, all the texts are all, in many ways, speculative, and yet at the same time carefully preyed upon and inspired, so that, and like many things in the church, in the United Methodist Church, it's run by committees. So there was a committee that gathered together and said, you know, this sounds good, let's add it in. The Gospels. So Paul, again, as I mentioned, the letters of Paul are the earliest of the New Testament writings. And by 64 AD, under Emperor Nero, Paul is beheaded. Around the same time, Peter was also executed. You know, tradition says that he was crucified, and he didn't feel, you know, tradition says he was crucified upside down, right? There's nothing in Scripture says that. It's tradition. So we have always this balancing act of, you know, tradition that has kind of been passed on. When we looked at the Jewish sacred text, there was this thing called the oral tradition that gets passed on. You know, so Paul or Peter being crucified upside down, that is an oral tradition that got passed on. Maybe yes, maybe no, we don't know. But anyhow, around 64, 65 AD, there's massive persecution among some of the leaders of the early church. And Nero, during his final days, went crazy, blamed a big fire in Rome to the Christians and persecuted a lot of them and started executing them. Around that time, there is a movement, or scholars think there was an urgency that they needed to start writing down, because up till now, all we had were Paul's letters. And again, that wasn't really meant to be doctrinal, right? They were just letters. And so as far as the community was concerned, they didn't have any text. And so there's this concern of, we need to start writing, someone needs to write down about Jesus, who Jesus was, right, or his ministry. And so the first of the Gospels that we know of is the Gospel of Mark, which was dated around 70 AD. 70 AD is a critical date in Jewish history because that is when the Romans came down and because of an insurrection, they pretty much destroyed Jerusalem. Right? They talk about not a single wall was left standing, the temple was destroyed, and so forth. I don't know why I picked a picture of the Colosseum, because that's not Jerusalem, that's Rome. Anyhow, ignore the picture. So, 70 AD Jerusalem is overrun by the Romans. And during that time, and it didn't happen just in one night. It was actually a sustained conquest, I guess. In 68 AD, the emperor was Emperor Vespasian, which was one of the generals under Nero. So after Nero dies, there's a power struggle among the four generals, and then Vespasian becomes emperor. And Vespasian didn't have any liking for Jerusalem, so he sends legions. He sends a whole legion, which comprises of something like, I don't know, what is it, 8,000 soldiers or something, down to Jerusalem. Around 68 AD, they surround Jerusalem, and basically what they do is prevent anyone from entering or leaving. They starve the city, right? And they starve the city, and then they rush in. The whole process took around 3.5 years. And so by 70 AD, they go in, they pretty much wipe out everyone. There's a remnant that runs away, goes to a neighboring hillside, Masada, and it takes another 3.5 years, and then they themselves. In fact, everyone who kind of escaped committed suicide because there was no way out. The whole conquest is about 7 years, which is an interesting number when you start reading the book of Revelation. Anyhow, so Mark, we know, was during that early conquest of Jerusalem that he writes the first gospel. And it's the shortest of the gospels. It only has 16 chapters. And when you read it, you can definitely hear the sense of urgency. That yeah, that he needed to get the word out of who Jesus was. Yet at the same time, the theme that runs through the Gospel of Mark is that Jesus is the hidden Messiah. The stories that Mark tells are Jesus, doing some, miraculous thing or heal someone or something like that, and then he tells them, "Don't tell anyone." Right? And you kind of wonder, why would Jesus tell the disciples, "Don't tell anyone who he is"? Because isn't that what the gospel's about? Tell everyone. Well, Mark writes it where Jesus is the hidden Messiah, because at that time, what was happening? Those who were known as being followers of Jesus were being persecuted. So there's this, challenge of, you got to keep it a secret, but yet pass the word. Keep it a secret, but yet pass it on. So Mark is the first of the Gospels. Soon after Mark is written, there are two other Gospels that propagate, and that is Matthew and Luke. They're written about 75 to 85 AD. We're starting to get really far away from the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, right? 30 AD. So we're talking about 45, 50, 55 years later. Some people even date it even past that. But generally 75 to 85 AD. And the two Gospels are very different. They're written around the same time. This is after Jerusalem is destroyed, but these two Gospels have very specific context. Matthew was written to the Jewish community. And because it's written to the Jewish community, he focuses on Jesus being the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. Again, the view of the Christian community already was that the Hebrew Bible was going to be a precursor or something that leads to or points to Jesus being the Messiah. Jesus is, and scholars who have studied Matthew kind of see how he kind of plays this, kind of overlays the life of Moses with the life of Jesus. That Jesus is the new Moses. And you get this in Jesus' birth story in the Gospel of Matthew, right? Because in the Gospel of Matthew, you have the whole story of the wise men coming, and then King Herod gets upset, and so he kills all the babies, right? Just like what happened to Moses, right? And then angel comes to Joseph and Mary and tells them to run away, and they run away to Egypt. So you have this parallelism, right, of Jesus being the new Moses. The Gospel of Matthew is also broken into 5 sections, what we call 5 discourses. There's the Sermon on the Mount, which, by the way, there's a whole sermon series going on with that somewhere. There is the mission, okay, so where he calls upon the disciples or the followers to say, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Right? There is this call to mission. Then there's a whole section of just one parable after another. And then there's a section that talks about how the relationship within the church and the church structure or community structure, and then talking about the end times, or the word eschatology. So why is that important? Well, again, what Matthew is doing is contrasting the life and ministry of Jesus with what Moses provided to the Jewish people, the Torah, which was the 5 books. So the 5 discourses and the 5 books kind of overlay each other. Luke, again, written around the same time, was written to the Gentile community. And to the Gentile community, he starts off by saying, dear Theophilus, which actually just means lover of God, so it may be a pseudonym, not a real person. But he writes it to more of the Gentile community, and what he's doing is he's trying to create, log what he says is an orderly account of Jesus' ministry. By this time, there are other stories that's propagating, some conflicting with each other, and so he writes an orderly account. And one of the clear focus of Luke is that he focuses much of the gospel on highlighting those who are the least, the last, and the lost in Jesus' ministry. They're unique stories that are only in Luke. That's not in Mark, That's not in Matthew. Stories that we love, like the Good Samaritan, right? Again, someone that's hurt, and a Samaritan comes to help them. The story of the prodigal son, the lost, right? That's only in Luke. So these three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are what we call the Synoptic Gospels, right? And these Synoptic Gospels, the word synoptic just means synchronous, synchronous, optic. So looking at it through the same lens. Because the stories in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's like you get someone that's new to the Christian faith, and you give them the Bible and tell them, oh, start reading from the New Testament. They start reading Matthew, and they start reading Mark, and they start reading Luke, and they ask themselves, why are the stories repeating themselves, right? Because it sounds like it's the same story. Well, it's because the way the sourcing of these, the sources that Matthew and Mark used. So Matthew and Luke used. So Matthew and Luke, we know that both of them had the Gospel of Mark available to them. Again, Mark was written right around 70 AD, both Matthew and Luke around 80, 75, 85 AD. So they must have had a copy of Mark. We definitely know that Matthew had a copy of Mark, because 90% of Mark is word for word contained in Matthew. There are common stories that Matthew and Luke has, right? But there's some stories that's not, yes, it's cute. Q just means, it's not the political Q, don't worry about that. It's Q as in Greek, it's called quelle, which just means source. Okay, the letter Q in Greek just means the source. So, or you can think James Bond, it's the guy that makes all the gadgets. We know that there's some stories that Matthew and Luke has, it's the exact same story, but that's not in Mark. So that means that Matthew and Luke must have gotten that story from somewhere, common source, but that Mark didn't have. So we call that Q. We don't know. It's some common source. And then each Matthew and Luke have unique stories to themselves. So we have source M for Matthew, source L for Luke. Really ingenious, right? But what we know is that, yes, Matthew had his own source. He had a copy of Mark. He also had some source Q that added to his story. I'm going to get back to Q, because one of the things that a lot of scholars think what Q was it wasn't a separate gospel, because there's no other gospel that was around at this time. There were other gospels starting to propagate, but this early on, it's not quite there. They think Q was a collection of Jesus' sayings. Like someone went around and just kind of taking notes, Ooh, that's a great phrase, right? They think it's something that's not really structured, but it was something that both Matthew and Luke had. All right, we'll get back to Q. But about 10 years afterwards, there's another gospel that comes out, which is the Gospel of John, and we know this. It's much more mystical, and it's what we call a Gnostic gospel. It doesn't read like Matthew, Mark, or Luke, right? It's more sermonic. It reads like a sermon, and it's definitely written from a completely different perspective. I'm going to go faster. The Acts of the Apostles is one that we know is part 2 of the Gospel of Luke. And we know that because at the very beginning of the Gospel of Acts, or not Gospel of Acts, the book of Acts, the writer, Luke, says, again, in my earlier book, Theophilus, I talked about the ministry of Jesus. Let me tell you now what happened afterwards. And then he gets into the stories. Now, the stories starts off with the early church, and then it quickly focuses on Paul, right? Starting from like chapter 6, it talks about Paul kind of being there. In chapter 8, when Stephen, the first martyr, is martyred, Paul is there, and it's chapter 9, Paul's conversion, and after that, it's all about Paul's ministry, for up to chapter 28. How much influence did Paul have in the development of the Christian faith, and in the composition of our New Testament? Well, again, if you think about it, how many letters that I say was attributed to Paul? Well, there are 7 original or genuine, but 13 are attributed to Paul, right? In addition to that, John Mark was actually someone who traveled with Paul at some point. John Mark is the writer of Mark, right? So the Gospel of Mark, whoever the writer of Mark, must have had some connection with Paul, because in the book of Acts, it talks about who John Mark was. Mark was actually the nephew of Barnabas, and Barnabas was the one who kind of took Paul under his wings when Paul converted and started to kind of join in with the rest of the Christian community. So there's actually a passage where it talks about Mark going on a missionary journey with Paul briefly. Paul gets annoyed with him and says, I don't want to take Mark anymore, and then that creates a division between Barnabas and Paul. But Mark was influenced by Paul in early ministry. Luke was also a contemporary of Paul, because in the book of Acts, when you start reading about his second missionary journey, all of a sudden, the language changes. It starts to say, oh, Paul and the missionaries went there and did this, and all of a sudden it changes to, and then we, experienced this, we saw this, we, faced this challenge. And so then all of a sudden that Luke, or the writer of Luke, must have been on that second missionary journey. So now you have the 13 letters that were attributed to Paul. You have Mark and Luke, who have traveled with Paul. 90% of Mark is contained in Matthew. So the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are influenced by Paul, the 13 letters of Paul. That's a lot of Paul. Do you know what Paul means? Little. Little. The word Paul means little. I know. He was not one, he was a big character. He may have been small, but I don't know. Anyhow. And then, of course, we have the other book in the New Testament is Revelation. John of Patmos. It's written by John of Patmos. There are 3 groupings of John in the New Testament. There is the gospel writer John, right, who wrote the Gospel of John. And we think that John, tradition and for the most part, the Gospel of John may have been written by Jesus' youngest disciple, John. And so that's the Gospel of John. And then there's these 3 letters of John. 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, very short letters. That's not Paul's letters, but it's John's letters. And the writing style is similar enough where some people say, yeah, it could have been the same person, or it could be an associate. It definitely came from the same group or community. And then there's this guy named John of Patmos. And now, some traditionalists would say that it's the same John, right? Well, he would have had to live a really long time because the book of Revelation was written in like 95, 100 AD. So that's like 70 years after Jesus. People didn't live that long. Anyhow, but it is an apocalyptic literature. there must have been something. So Patmos is an island, it's a penal island, it's where John was exiled by the emperor. It was written during a time when Emperor Domitian was persecuting all of the Christians. Domitian was the son of Emperor Vespasian, and Vespasian's the one who sent the legion to destroy Jerusalem. So it's in the bloodline. And John was exiled on this island, and he writes this account of, yes, a battle, of a conflict, but the book of Revelation is actually a letter of trying to give hope to the Christian community during the persecution to say, I know it's hard, and yes, there's imageries of dragons and demons and blah, 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 all of this stuff, cosmic warfare, but ultimately the book is about, at the end, there will be a new kingdom, a new Jerusalem, a new city, and then the kingdom of God is what finally brings everything together. So it is that a writing of hope that is written to the early community. Now, okay, so I just went through just all the books in the New Testament. How did these books come together? It's called the process of canonization. And as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, the word canon, it means like a ruler, right? Like a measuring stick, like a plumb line. And so the process of canonization is to select, and it's done by committee, is to select text that is consistent, like on a straight ruler, consistent with the rest of theology. And the questions that the early church leaders asked were, as they got all these writings from, and again, because Jesus didn't write anything, and even though Paul wrote some of his letters, the original letters were all gone. What happened to those letters is that these churches would make copies of these letters, scribes, and they didn't have Xerox machines back then. So it's all by hand. And you guys know what happens when you try to copy something by hand, right? There's mistakes, and then you make copies of a copy, which is mistakes on a mistake. Sometimes it corrects itself. Amazing, call that miracles. But for the most part, there's more mistakes that get added on. There's this whole process of all these manuscripts. In fact, there's almost 6,000 manuscripts. Now, a lot of them are fragments, but there's like 6,000 manuscripts of the New Testament that scholars comb through, trying to figure out which came first, which one, where are the mistakes? There is no two manuscript that is consistently the same. There's errors everywhere. A lot of them are minor, but again, because these are sacred texts, every word makes a big difference when you're dealing with theology. So the questions that they ask is, one, were the writings, were they written by one of the apostles or one of the associates? So as they were looking at, especially the early writings, the Gospels primarily, they asked the question, were these written by someone that was in close proximity, or what do you call that? 6 degrees of separation? Well, they want to make me like just 2 degrees of separation for Jesus. Somehow closely related to Jesus. Were they widely accepted by numerous Christian communities? So there were some churches that had certain texts that was not accepted by other churches. Well, okay, that church may like that writing, but it wasn't going to become authoritative. And thirdly, were they in harmony with the doctrines and the teaching of the 4 Gospels? The first 4 Gospels were selected early on, and that became the litmus test. By the time this canonization process comes around in the 4th century, there's over 80 Gospels floating around. None of the 80 Gospels made it because of this litmus test. And they're talking about Gospels like, well, I'll get to that, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Gospel of Judas. And I'm thinking, well, Judas, didn't he hang out with Jesus? Not a good guy, but still, hung out with Jesus? Well, still, there were some issues there. So the canonization process, just a quick date. In 367 AD, Athanasius, the bishop of Egypt, so by this time there were manuscripts everywhere, okay, and there were all these different writings. In 367 AD, the bishop of Egypt is the first one to make a list of what he considered authoritative. It's interesting because the list that he made is the exact 27 books that we have in the New Testament. But even after 367, there were other people that kept discussing it. And even today, the Orthodox Church has a different set of New Testament books than we do. They have 1 Corinthians, 2nd, 3rd Corinthians, and 3rd Corinthians. We don't have a 3rd Corinthians. Yeah, so, they have different books. Going more, fast forwarding a millennia, in 1455, the Gutenberg Bible. So up till this point, again, once the canonization process they kind of put together what books would be authoritative or not, like I said, they were still heavily debated, primarily when it came to the apocryphal texts. Remember the apocryphal text in the in the Old Testament? There were these extra books that the Septuagint added in that wasn't part of the Hebrew Bible. Well, some of those apocryphal texts is very important to the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church that has them. An example of that is Maccabees. We don't have the book of Maccabees. There's 4 books of Maccabees. The Orthodox churches have 4 of them, as you can see in here, right? Under historical books, we all have Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Interesting. We have it under all the Christian churches have it as a historical book. In the Jewish context, Ruth is not a historical book. It's a story. It's a writing. And then, we have 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 and then you get into some of these other books, right? Esdras, Judith, Tobit, and then the Maccabees. Both the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church have the books of Maccabees. Why? And they fought hard to keep it. In fact, what happened, so the Gutenberg Bible is important because shortly before that, the printing press came along, right? And the printing press changed everything about sacred texts. Why? Up till then, only select people would have any copy or access to Scripture, right? Usually only the priests, and even that, only some of them. Well, the printing press made the Bible accessible, right? And so in 1455, the first Gutenberg Bible is printed. In 1522, Martin Luther translates it into German for the first time, which then creates this whole, it's like, okay, he translated, hey, let's translate it too. And so all of a sudden, you get the Bibles being translated in vernacular languages all over. Now, remember what I said about translations? You get into issues, right? 1526, William Tyndale translate to English. Okay, that was the very first English translation. And that one too, he translated only the New Testament into English. And he was working on translating the Old Testament when he was charged with heresy. The way he translated it, he was charged with heresy by the Catholic Church and burned at the stake. So he never completed the Old Testament. So translations was not just like, it was a life and death situation here, right? If you translated wrong, anyhow. So in 1546, this is very important. In 1546, the Catholic Church, and again, at that time, there's only one church, it's the Catholic Church. Well, the Orthodox Church had already split off, but for the most part, it's just the Catholic Church, right? The Protestant churches, 1517, the Protestant Church breaks off, but then they're pretty much exiled from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church still has power. In 1546, after Luther translates into German and William Tyndale, they prosecute William Tyndale, execute him. In 1546, the Catholic Church calls a council, which is basically a general meeting, and says, we're going to set things straight. This is what is considered authoritative Bible. And at the Council of Trent, they made the Catholic Bible with the Apocryphal being authoritative. Why was that important? Because it's in the book of Maccabees, the stories in Maccabees that talks about the theology of purgatory. Without Maccabees, Protestants are like, purgatory? It's nowhere in the Bible. And the Catholic says, yes, it is. It's in the book of Maccabees. It's also in the book of Maccabees that have the practice of indulgences, which is very important to the Catholic Church. Protestants are like, what? Indulgences? Chocolate, but no. But no, these practices, again, practice in theology come from Scripture, sacred texts. And so the struggles, the battles, the reason why they burned these translators at the stake is because these sacred texts is important to validating the beliefs. 1560, John Calvin and John Knox translate, or it's in English. Is it in English? No, it's in French. It's in French. The Geneva Bible, and then of course 1611, the King James Bible. The King James Bible becomes the authoritative Bible for about 3 centuries. And then after 3 centuries, I didn't have room, so let me kind of tell you what happens after that. Even after all this, you have multiple translations, right? So in 1895, finally they realized, or by the 19th century, they realized that the Old King James, or the King James Bible in Old English, has started becoming harder and harder to understand. The Old English becomes hard to understand, and so then there becomes a push to start translating the Bible to an English translation that was easier to understand. So in 1885, the Revised King James is published. Followed by then, in 1952, so 60 or 70 years later, the Revised Standard Version. Now, by this time, you guys are like, I know that translation, right? The Revised Standard Version was the general rule of thumb. But by this time, everyone is, again, writing their translations. And so you have the American Standard Version, the English Standard Version, you have the New International Version. It's like every area saying, oh, this is going to be the standard version. So in America, it became the American Standard Version. In England, was the English Standard Version. And then Zondervan came out and said, we're going to make the international version, trump everyone, right? So that's the NIV version. And then now what we use is, what we use here at the church is the New Revised Standard Version. But you see how this happens, right? We have the New Revised Standard Version, which was updated from the Revised Standard Version, which was updated from the Revised King James Version, which was revised from the King James Version, right? Guess what? There is a new Revised Standard Version. I know, they don't want to call it the new. So they call it the New Revised Standard Version updated. And that's the version now. All right, quickly.
Has the Bible been translated into the African languages?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Every language on earth.
Pretty much. There's some that is not yet, but they're actively in the process right now. One of the languages that's in the process, and one of our clergy in the Methodist Church in our conference is the forerunner in translating is into Vietnamese. Yes. The Bible is not fully translated into Vietnamese yet. Only partially. Yeah.
It is in Mandarin?
It's in Mandarin, yeah. Mandarin, in Cantonese, Mandarin, Korean, all of that. But again, some of these countries, smaller countries, even like Vietnamese, you would think, oh, that's pretty common, right? You have a Vietnamese restaurant here and there. But it's not fully translated yet, so there's work being done. Book of Mormon, so I'm going to go into a slight, offshoots. the Book of Mormon is one where, okay, is it a sacred text? Well, it is to Mormons, right? Now, the story about the Book of Mormons, and I don't know if, so Joseph Smith, when he was about 17 years old in upstate New York, was lying in bed, praying, just doing his night prayer, asking for forgiveness and whatever, when all of a sudden his room lights up and an angel appears to him running and tells him that nearby there's an ancient record of on these metal sheets that is hidden away not too far from where he was, and that these records were from the ancient inhabitants, right, or ancient people in America, and the angel disappears. So the next morning, the angel appears 3 times that night. Just like how Peter had the vision of the sheet with the animals coming down 3 times, something happens in 3 times, pay attention, right? So if you have a recurring dream 3 times, start writing it down, right? And so this happens 3 times. So the next morning, he goes out onto the field, and he recognizes this rock in that vision that he had, and underneath that rock was a box, a stone box, which contained the 3 metal sheets. And along with that, these golden sheets was some sort of an apparatus that you had to look through. It's like one of those seer stones. I think of it was like those things that, colored lenses that you had to, the secret writings, Didn't you guys have that? Yeah. Right? Yeah. So anyhow, so he got the seer stone, and he was about to take the plates out to take it home to start reading it, and the angel appeared to him and again says that no, it's not time yet. Come back next year. So next year he comes back, and again the angel said, not yet. Come back next year. This happens 3 times. And finally, on the 4th time, in, what year is this? 1827, the angel finally allows him to take the metal sheets back home. And by that time, he's married, and then he has his neighbor. And he reads it through the seer stone. And as he reads it, they start dictating what he writes. And the way they said it is, he would dictate it, and then they would read it back to him to make sure it's accurate, and he would correct them, and so then, anyhow, that's how the Mormon Bible came about. Now, the interesting with the Mormon Bible is that it's like in our Christian Bible, the Christian community formed first, without a sacred text. The Jewish community formed, and then the text was written to kind of make sense of the faith. In the Book of Mormon, there was no Mormon community. The text came first, and from the text formed the community. And the way they see it is that because this is almost dictated, it is of high value. It's almost like the Quran, right? It's dictated, and because it's 1800s, right? Early, it's in the 1900s. They actually have the original translations. So anyhow, some people have argued, well, are Mormons Christian? Are part of the Christianity, and that's been debated because the debate has always been because, in terms of sacred text, the Christian stance on sacred text is that the canonization is closed, right? In the Gospel of John, it talks about you cannot add or take anything out of it, even though the whole process was about adding and taking out and trying to figure out which one is which. Given that, once the canonization was done in the 4th century, they said this is the Bible, or it wasn't even finalized until like 15th, Council of Trent, and even after that, Martin Luther. Once it's set, they don't want nobody. You're not supposed to, and so the Christian communities would say that, well, you can't add the Book of Mormon that's going against the canonization, and that is the debate or the argument that they're not part of the Christian faith. However, interesting thing is, isn't that what we did with the New Testament? We took the Hebrew Bible and we added the New Testament. So, so again, it's debatable. But that is the sacred text of the Mormons. There's a couple of things that a couple other texts that I want to kind of share with you real quickly. I know I'm way over time. So, like I said, during the 4th century, it was Bible when the Bible was still going through the canonization process. There were other gospels that started propagating by this time. Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Gospel of Thomas, and Gospel of Judas. And the most popular common is the Gospel of Thomas. There's actually 2 Gospel of Thomases, and I forgot to bring the book. It's on my desk. I have the Gospel of Thomas, and there's actually a book, this book, which actually has the non-canonical, it's what I used in seminary, that has the excerpts of the non-canonical texts in there. Anyhow, in the Gospel of Thomas, there's 2 Gospel of Thomases. One of them is one that is was widely distributed. A lot of the churches in 4th century, there's multiple copies of this, the first Gospel of Thomas, which it's actually just a collection of sayings of Jesus. And so a lot of scholars and they still kind of debate this, could that Gospel of Thomas be Q? Now, there are some people say no, but it's interesting that the first Gospel of Thomas is just a collection of sayings, and they are. I mean, the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you read it, it's like, oh, exactly, how it was written. The second Gospel of Thomas is a narrative, and it's actually a narrative of his early year, Jesus' early year. It tells about Jesus when he was like 5 years old. And these stories are, this is the reason why. Well, let me tell you the story, and you tell me whether we should add this to the canon or not. So in one of the stories, it tells about when Jesus was 5 years old. He's playing on the Sabbath, and he's playing with mud, and he forms these sparrows. He forms 12 sparrows out of mud. And then a neighbor comes along and complains to Joseph, saying, your son is breaking the Sabbath. That kind of play is not allowed on the Sabbath, making things, right? And so then Joseph goes to Jesus and says, son, why are you doing this? And then Jesus says, okay, you're free. And he claps his hands, and then the clay sparrows flies off. That's the first story. There's another story. There's actually another one, not so nice story, where Jesus is playing, and then the kid runs into him, and then Jesus gets mad and says to him, you shall go no further from here. And literally, the guy just drops dead and dies. And so the parent gets very upset can't get mad at Jesus in case Jesus says something. So he gets mad at Joseph, saying, control your son, because he cannot be doing this because our children are dying. And then another story, okay, one more story. Jesus and this other boy is playing on the rooftop of their house, and the boy accidentally falls off the roof and dies. And so the parents of the boy come, and they accuse Jesus of pushing him off the roof. And so Jesus comes down, and you know what he does? He resurrects the boy so that the boy can testify that he didn't push him. So that's in the Gospel of Thomas, the infant narrative. Should we add that? So you can see there's some stories here why some of these texts were not added. In this book, when I was in seminary, there's one other non-canonical text that was found in 1958 at an ancient monastery. And it's fragments of these manuscripts, ancient manuscripts, that were part of the Gospel of Mark. It has fragments in the Gospel of Mark, but these fragments were inserts between passages in Mark that were not in the canonized Mark. And so there's been debate about whether to add these or not. And what's in these fragments, it tells of certain stories of Mark that is actually pretty obscure. In the Gospel, in Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all three of them tell about the story of the rich young ruler. You guys know that one, right? The rich young man goes up to Jesus and asks, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus tells him, well, blah, blah, blah. After a couple conversations, he says, well, then sell everything and then follow me. Right? He says, follow the rules and follow the laws. And the rich young man says, I've done all that. And so then Jesus tells him, well, sell everything and then follow me. And then the story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that he goes away sad because he couldn't, right? In this extra fragment, it actually follows, and it actually fits perfectly into the storyline. And it tells about, in that fragment, it talks about how this rich young ruler actually follows through, sells everything, and starts following Jesus. And then that fragment continues on to the story where in the garden when Jesus is being arrested. If you read I forgot my Bible. If you read the Gospel of Mark, there's a really funny text in our Bible, in the canonized Bible. And if you guys ever paid attention to this, it talks about when the soldiers came and then they were arresting Jesus, right? That the disciples fled, but there was this one man who was following Jesus, who was wearing nothing but a linen cloth. And so then the guards got hold of the linen cloth, and the guy ran off naked. It's like 1 or 2 verses right there. And if you read it, it's like, what? Where did that come from? Right? Well, the secret gospel, or this fragment, actually talks about that. Because it actually, the fragment actually points to that young man actually being the rich young man that sold everything, so he had nothing except the shirt on his back. Yeah. And so he was following Jesus, following what Jesus told him to do, follow him even to the end. Even when the other disciples left, he stuck around, even to the point where when it says that the soldiers grabbed his cloak and he ran off naked, it's talking about his outer physical form. And so he died. He died following Jesus. Now you think that the story ends there? No. The fragments, again, there's pieces, right? The other piece that fits in is actually at the resurrection scene. At the resurrection scene, I don't know if you know this, but the 4 Gospels, they all tell a different story of resurrection. In the Gospel of Matthew, it talks about an angel that is there at the day of resurrection, right, and greets Mary Magdalene. In the Gospel of Luke, there are 2 men, right, that is there. In the Gospel of John, there are 2 angels. So come on, is it 1 angel, 2 angels? Is it a guy or is it an angel? In Mark, it's 1 man. And that's the rich young guy that sold everything, followed Jesus to the end, and on the day of Jesus' resurrection, he also comes back with Jesus. That's the secret gospel that this fragment talks about. So there's been discussion, wow, that's a cool story. Shouldn't that be added in? Well, just like the Gospel of Thomas, it's closed.
Wasn't there a book of Judas also?
There is.
Where he was actually the chosen.
Yeah.
Instead of selling for money, he was then chosen to be the instrument of.
Exactly.
So they're great stories, but the way the canonization of sacred stories work, or sacred texts work, is that once it's canonized, it's closed. But we'll see. Maybe in 2,000 years they'll slip it in. Right? All right. Well,